This is a statement that Andy Abbott sent us, which is really more to do with reunions in general than about the books that he's written during his academic career. He writes, I still work full-time and have students taking their BAs, MAs, and PhDs on the day of our reunion. Offline, I'm just another guy in his late 70s with various aches and pains, a social manner that works for some people, and a surrounding assemblage of friends, memories, and regrets that floats more and more adrift from the real world. I'm still tall and thin and self-absorbed. The class elected me pious and straight arrow 60 years ago, and the lineage of those qualities is clear enough in my life. I have never been conventionally unconventional, only unconventionally conventional. I found the alumni thing fascinating but strange. How tenuous the links between past and present. But they persist, even as they are redefined. Neither we nor Andover nor the world bear much resemblance to what they were in June 1966. But reunions offer a kind of a controlled encounter across this sea of change. They tell us how open we were to each other, but at the same time how closed. My own connection to Andover has been suddenly reduced by the death of Eric Almquist, my closest friend from our class. We had known each other from our hurdling days in the old cage, and I kept Eric in contact with the academic work he had done and the career he had been denied by the crash of the academic job market in the late 1970s. We stayed close through the years, talking from time to time of many things. For recent reunions, I had stayed with him in Belmont, and we had driven up to Andover for the day and evening events. His death makes it all different.
So, greetings to all my Andover classmates, and I'm sorry I can't join you at the reunion. I hope you're having a great time. Thanks to Rick and to Ray and others for setting up this project so that we can talk about our career as writers with the fellow classmates. I am delighted to be able to join you even remotely this way. Let me just talk about, first of all, my path as a writer. I was 7 years old when I decided I was going to be a writer, and come what may, my sister and I used to play theater, and she would act, I would write the plays. So that set me on the course. I came from an academic and political background, so creative arts and the theater weren't really in the cards for me. I went sort of the traditional route after Andover. I went to Columbia and then Columbia Law School. I have to admit that the law school trip was basically to avoid the draft, but it was a great bit of training and I met some great people. I spent about a year afterwards in the law field and then decided I really could make the change over to playwriting. I was in New York for several years, and there I got involved with the public theater under Joe Papp, and I was working my way up through the kind of hierarchy at the theater. And then I decided that I couldn't make a living doing this and that I wanted to be able to pay the bills. And so I met my wife and moved to Los Angeles. And that opened up a whole new world of opportunity. I spent the next few years in LA, and actually the next 20 years in LA, doing a combination of both screenwriting, commercial screenwriting for the film studios and TV networks. And I was basically a yeoman screenwriter, which means that you're writing a lot of scripts for pay that never get produced or that few get produced. But it was financially rewarding and kept me going, and I was able to continue to write plays, which was really my true love during that period. I also started writing for Daily Variety, And for them, I did theater and television criticism, and then I also taught playwriting and screenwriting at UCLA. So I was able to combine a bunch of different interests and still manage to pay the bills. So by about the year 2000, I felt financially stable enough so that I was doing less commercial assignments for screenwriting and pursuing some of my own personal projects. That included writing a couple of three political thrillers and novels, and also one book that was kind of a parody that did very well. Actually, sold in the six-figure category, so that was great. And my interest in politics grew then, and I was delegate to the National Convention for Obama and worked for him. And then I ran for Congress in a pretty solidly Republican district. Didn't have much of a chance, but it was a great experience. And continued my interest in politics thereafter. I started writing for national media on political topics and cultural topics as well, and all the while continuing with my screenwriting and playwriting. And then in recent years, I have been active in Southern California. I'm the chair of the Democratic committee here that really consists of a number of the Democratic clubs and grassroots organizations called the United Democratic Headquarters. We've been very busy and will continue to be busy in the upcoming midterms. And I'm also the president of a $100 million foundation that serves about 25,000 minority students in one of the colleges here. So it's been a great ride. I've really enjoyed writing. You know, the adventure, the terror of confronting the blank page never goes away. You can't really count on your successes to propel you to the future. But it's a real generative career in life, and ups and downs, but something that I've really enjoyed, and thanks to education Andover and college and university, it's been very helpful, but also a lot of experiences to write about. So have a great reunion, and I will look forward to seeing you all sometime soon. Take care.
When I think back on it, writing has been one of the three most uh, or lengthiest strands of continuity in my life. The others are running, jogging these days, and the city of Seattle, where I've lived almost all my life. It's been a base, even though I've worked and traveled all over the world. I started writing in junior high school for the junior high school paper. At Andover, I wrote for the Mirror. In college, I wrote for the Crimson and the Independent and the Seattle Times. And shortly after college, because I had worked in the U.S. Senate for a while, I wrote a book about my experiences there that, to my surprise, became a bestseller and paid for my law school and other things. And uh, that was published by Simon Schuster, and I pressured them. They wanted me to write another nonfiction book, and I wanted to write a novel. And I had a novel in mind, and that called The Interlopers. But life took its course. At law school, I was writing various things for various people, magazines, and so forth, book reviews for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others. I became a contributing editor of Rolling Stone magazine. I wrote an article that got me 15 minutes of national fame about Richard Nixon trying to blow up the Paris peace talks in 1968. Um, but then for 50 years, I was writing book reviews. I was writing magazine articles. I was writing law review articles. I wrote briefs to the U.S. Supreme Court, but I was working as a lawyer, and I never got back to writing books. And then finally, when I was in my 70s, I decided I would uh, start writing again, pick up the keyboard now, and sit down in front of a laptop and see what I could do. And so I wrote, as it happened, a murder mystery set in Hawaii, a novel set in Hawaii, and I was very fortunate to find a publisher. I was fortunate that it became a finalist for a best first novel for international thriller writers, which gave me the opportunity to write a second novel in the series, which I did, which did not do nearly as well. Um, and now I'm working on a third, and beyond that, there's a fourth. And then finally, I'm going to go back to that novel, The Interlopers, which is not a murder mystery, not detective fiction, the one I wanted to write back in 1975 when I had a contract for it that many years ago, more than 50 years ago now. So this late in life, I can just say that for me, I don't know it's true for everybody, but for me, writing is the activity of my mind that I find most gratifying. I enjoy it most, and when I'm writing, I'm absorbed in that world. It gets harder as you get older. I find my vocabulary isn't what it used to be, and my ability to construct complicated sentences isn't what it used to be. I remember at Andover, we were taught that we needed to be able to write a sentence of 200 words when the occasion warranted it, and a paragraph of 400 words. Almost no one does that anymore, but that's how we were taught. That's what we learned. I also retained the lessons that we got from the three great English teachers I had. We had Mr. Hawes and Mr. Regan, and of course Dudley Fitz. Dudley Fitz did me a huge favor when he graded one paper and said in the paper, and responding to it, he said, "You overwrite because you overfeel." And I have tried ever since to remember that and to take my writing, particularly my fiction, make sure that I'm not overfeeling as I write it. So I hope others of our class who've been writers have enjoyed the same degree or more of gratification from the activity that I have. And I would urge anybody who hasn't written one yet, believe me, everybody should write a first novel, whether it's going to be published or not. Writing a first novel teaches you so much more about novels and makes you appreciate them so much more when you're reading them. Okay, I look forward to seeing you at the reunion, those of us whom I will see.
Hello, I'm Jim Kunen, class of '66, Phillips Academy, Andover. I've been asked to share a few thoughts about writing. So, okay, here's what I think. All of us are imprisoned for life in a little cell for each of us, about 8 inches deep and 6 inches wide with bone walls, and there's no getting out. So in a situation like that, what do? You tap on the walls. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. In the hope that someone will answer. That's writing. And even if no one ever answers, what do? In your little bone cell, you scratch on the wall. Scratch, 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 to leave a mark, in the hope that someone someday will see it and know that you existed. That's writing. Now, some people ask, how do you write? How do you write well? Well, there are really just 3 rules. 1, pay attention to rhythm. 2, don't repeat words. And 3, never write a sentence like, lives there a man who hasn't wanted to fuck a cow? So be careful out there. Just remember, you don't know what you don't know. Happy 60th.
Hi, I'm standing here in a place I sailed into in 2018 with my youngest daughter and fell in love with the house, and the rest so far is history. But I'm taking up the assignment to make some kind of video for my reunion class on why I became a writer, which is something that's even hard to say out loud for some reason. Anyway, I was raised in a family that revered language and books and words, and where the Oxford Unabridged Dictionary had its own place in my father's library, walled with shelves that he built in himself. They were occupied by, the books of a young English boy, Rudyard Kipling and Rider Haggard and G.A. Henty and Stevenson and Churchill, celebrating adventure and the British Empire. And if at the nightly dinner table some word that had heretofore not been heard by somebody came up, one of us three siblings was dispatched to the study, as it came to be known, to look up the word in the dictionary and report back to the table. I suppose this reverence for things written, evident in the room that my father built with his own hands into that 1790 colonial we occupied during the 1950s, as I was clambering towards adolescence, imbued in me a sense that this held real value, to know the word, to use it in the right place and the right way, and to be able to write down a story in such a way that someone would want to print it, read it, share it, spread it around. Just when I first declared to myself or anyone else that I wished to, quote, become a writer, unquote, I cannot say. But I know that in grade school I was miles ahead of most of my classmates in what I had read or was reading, whether it was all the Rider Haggard novels, She, Ayesha, King Solomon's Mines, Not of the Lily, or obscure adventure novels about South Pacific explorers that in some cases detailed the most grotesque torturing techniques of prisoners who were buried in the sand while a canoe was dragged across their abdomens so their faces would explode. But these works persuaded me that words could take you places you had never been and might wish to go or to avoid altogether. By the time I exited Hamilton College as an English major of no particular great distinction, I had attempted a 400-page novel as a senior thesis, and to describe that as a bad novel would be to eloquently illustrate understatement. Looking back on it some years later, I realized that my best move on graduation as a putative writer would have been to follow my mentor's advice and go directly to Spain to work in a bar that was owned by his brother and get a Spanish girlfriend and learn language that way. But instead, following a track laid down by my brother, I went to the Lowell Sun and became a cub reporter in Massachusetts and began my education in crime and politics and economics at the local level to become a journalist. Jump ahead now 15 years to 1988 in San Francisco, where I had taken a job as a so-called enterprise editor at the San Francisco Examiner, which was still a Hearst paper in those days, where stories were not only exhaustively reported but distinctively written. By then I had done 2 years at the Lowell Sun, collected some awards, worked a year with delinquent teenagers, headed out to Stanford to the graduate writing program, and written about politics and crime for the Stockton, California Record before I took a Neiman year at Harvard studying economics. And then along came this Examiner job. All along the way, I dreamed of becoming a writer and had filled seemingly endless journals. I can count about 115 on my shelves now with whatever came out of my pen about what was around me or what was in me. Did this alone make me a writer? Or would that depend on some combination of being published and being publicly acclaimed? It was my father's father, Victor Best, by the early 70s, an ancient World War I veteran and renowned storyteller in his own right, who, when he learned I had become a journalist, remarked sadly, "Too bad, nothing ruins a good story like all those facts." It's true that of all the kinds of writers one might become, the novelist seemed the height of aspiration. A journalist was some kind of writer with a role to report accurately and to make a difference in public discourse and accountability, but not necessarily with any lasting artistic distinction. Again, my older brother, whom I revered, had blazed a piece of this path by going to Yale and engaging in the Scholar of the House program at Silliman College and writing a novel under the late, great Robert Penn Warren, who famously said to my brother, as he retold it later, after listening to my brother's labored attempt to describe this Russian prison novel he had in mind, "Well, Mr. Best, why don't you just tell me your story?" I suppose in light of my brother's subsequent conclusion that he was no Dostoevsky and not likely to be one, and so he abandoned his writing aspirations to become a corporate lawyer, I internalized this lesson as needing to tell my own story, the only one I really knew for sure. And so now, in light of this assignment, I realized that at the Examiner, after being an editor for several years, I went back to writing and persuaded them to let me sail my catch alone to Hawaii and back and write about it, which they allowed. And I came back and spent the next 20 years finishing Into My Father's Wake, which I'm going to claim is my claim to having become a writer. Thanks for listening.
Hi all, I am Bethe Moulton from Abbott 66. Since childhood, I've enjoyed writing, so when I retired, I tried my hand at writing a book. And since then, I have authored and self-published 3 books. My first book, Until Basile, I published in 2011, is a novel. In fact, a fictionalized memoir. It tells the story of how my worldview changed during a business assignment in Brazil. I hired a coach to guide me through the writing and publishing process. That was my investment in a master's of independent publishing. It was also a lesson in the unexpected responses that come when people who inhabit your world also inhabit your books, even if they are disguised. Until Basile received several awards from the independent press industry, so I gained confidence to try something more substantive. With my newfound skills, I worked with my mother to co-author a book that she had started in the late 1950s. Upon moving to Marblehead, Massachusetts, she had become intrigued by a self-taught artist named John Orne Johnson Frost, better known as J.O.J. He started to paint at the age of 70, and his paintings tell the story of the Marblehead fishermen and life on the Grand Banks, something Frost himself experienced as a teenager in the day of sail in the mid-1800s. Mother had done extensive research in the archives of the then Marblehead Historical Society and had written multiple drafts, but life took its course and the project ended up in a box. We rescued her crumbling records and created a coming-of-age story. Here is the cover of the book, and it gives you some taste of the Frost's painting style and vibrancy and storytelling power. And the title is Molly Waldo, A Young Man's First Voyage to the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, adapted from the stories of Marblehead fishermen of the 1800s. So suddenly I was a ghostwriter for ghosts. The books arrived from the printer on Mother's 90th birthday, half a century after she had begun this project. We gave the print run to the Marblehead Museum, renamed Historical Society, for fundraising for the J.O.J. Frost Gallery, a delightful space that showcases the Frost paintings. When Molly Waldo was used by a 5th grade teacher in the Marblehead schools to teach history, social studies, art, even math, I was sure Mother's dream had been fulfilled and I could turn my attention elsewhere. Well, not so. The night of our first school visit, Mother told me that many of the most important Frost paintings are not in Marblehead. No one knew what J.O.J. had painted and why works that had been given to the Marblehead Historical Society at the time of Frost's death were now in far-flung places, including the MFA in Boston, the Smithsonian, the Folk Art Museum in Williamsburg, the Fenimore in Cooperstown. So we set out to tell that story which involved a great deal of sleuthing and trust building with private collectors and museums alike. The end result was this volume, The Paintings of J.O.J. Frost, An American Story. Now, an art book brings along some very unique challenges. One must secure permissions and good photographs of the images of the paintings. One must prepare detailed and precise credits and notes and work in a very intense way with layout, design, captions, etc. Now, a board member of the Marblehead Museum was a Frost fan, and she was a designer of illustrated books. So Amy Drinker donated her time to do all of the layout and color work, which was no small feat because some of the images were close to 100 years old and some of the Kodachrome slides were over 50 years old. So this is just a quick example of one of the very old images, a photo taken of Frost with one of his wallboards in the mid-1920s. And this image is the actual wallboard painting that is in the Marblehead Museum. Many of Frost's works are in private collections or museum storage. They are inaccessible to the public. But at last, with this book, the world can see those images and learn the story, the incredible story of their scattering and survival. It's really the story of art's struggle to find its rightful place. So The Paintings of J.O.J. Frost was an honor book for the Historic New England Book Prize. And I'm especially proud of this because the competing entries, for the most part, were from very fine academic presses. As we did for Molly Waldo, we gave the production run to the museum for fundraising. Since the book's publication in 2013, numerous Frost paintings have come home to the museum as owners and benefactors have learned the story of those works. And also, it turns out I've become a bit of an expert in J.O.J. Frost. A reputable auction house sold a painting attributed to J.O.J. Frost. Once in the buyer's possession, he had doubts and contacted me. And using the images in the book, we demonstrated why it was a fake Frost. The auction house returned thousands of dollars to the buyer. So the challenge for me is not writing a book, but selling it. Both Frost books allowed for a very focused sales channel, the museum, while supporting a worthy cause. And I value self-publishing because you can keep complete control of your work, including the design and distribution. So you control the profit dynamics or lack thereof. I hope this has given you a taste of the satisfaction that these projects have provided, both during the writing process and the aftermath. I have had wonderful partnerships with expert resources for each of these books, and I wish each of you the same joy as you create works that will take on a life of their own and take readers to new places. Thanks for listening.
Okay.
So since you've had a public presence in many other fora, what made you decide to write books?
Well, I always mention this when I'm speaking to an audience of would-be writers or people who are interested in writing, and I tell them that I was in journalism. I was a journalist for 20 years before I figured out that I just hate news. I just don't like it. And I've reflected on, the great reporters they're like Dalmatians on a fire truck.
they love the excitement, the adrenaline burst. They love to go where news is taking place. And for me, it just wrecked my plans for the day. I mean, the one serious part of all this is that it was intensely frustrating to me to have to write a story at the end of every workday on deadline, not knowing as much as I really wanted to about the subject. And I just, it gave me great satisfaction to be able to take all the time I wanted to follow things out to their logical end. And so I turned to writing books. Um, and people occasionally will ask me if they don't know already, they'll say, well, do you write fiction or nonfiction? And I say, oh, it's nonfiction, except the parts that I make up. And, and by that, I mean that I used to keep a slogan over uh, my typewriter, my keypad, that said, "What happened next? What happens next?"
Yeah.
Because you have to keep a narrative flow going, and I found that if you could stitch everything together, and there is, frankly, a small element of fiction in there, but you can't make up something out of whole cloth, but you can infer from actual facts what the story was. So in books, I think I was still a storyteller, but I knew a lot more as a historian than I ever did as a journalist.
Wow. Makes sense. And so the things that you're talking about obtain in fiction writing as well as nonfiction. So were you ever tempted to go a little bit further into the fiction realm?
You know, I've thought about that a lot, Al, and I've never been tempted to write fiction because I don't have an internal grasp of great truths or anything like that. My big hobby, and I'm preoccupied by it, is solving puzzles. I get up every morning and I do the New York Times crossword puzzle. I do connections. I do spelling bee. I do Wordle, Quirtle, Sudoku. Any puzzle just absolutely gets me hooked. And the reason is I like figuring things out, and that's kind of what you do as an historian. I'll tell you a quick funny story. When I talk to writing seminars, when I encounter people who write or want to write, they will often say to me, "I love writing." And my answer is always, "Then you're not doing it right." Because either you have to do a lot of hard work or the reader will. And readers don't like to work hard. So, you're going to experience some pain and difficulty if you're writing up to the standards that you should be. So working on the Coke book years ago, and I would write all day and then go down to have a drink and dinner with Linda. And I was often in a pretty vile humor because I'd been suffering at my craft all day. But I went down one night, I was just completely out of sorts. And she said, being a sympathetic wife, she said, "Well, what's the problem?" And I said, "I couldn't make any narrative sense out of this period of time that I'm writing about in the history of Coca-Cola." And she actually helped me talk through it. And I realized that all the principles of the Coca-Cola Company for one dark year at the end of the 1970s and right into 1980, they had all gone mad. They were suffering from dementia in some cases, from drinking too much, from other disorders. But that company didn't have any narrative string to it
Hmm.
for quite a time. That's when they had the six vice chairmen who were duking it out, and it was just wild. But you try to impose some logic and narrative uh, uh, focus on these things, and sometimes you can't.
Yeah,
And you just have to say so.
indeed. Well, okay. What led you? I'm more familiar with your book about the Montana lynching during the Civil War, but what made you decide to tackle the issue of race in your most recent book?
Well, it's interesting. If you've ever written a book, I'm sure you know this as well as I do, then everyone you encounter, friends, acquaintances, total strangers, they'll invariably ask you, "Are you working on another book?"
True.
And for a long, long time, for about 20 years between the Montana book and this collection of essays on race, I really thought I was done. And bit by bit, uh, I arrived in Atlanta in 1972, and my first thought was, well, Rick, you've managed to miss the civil rights era. It's Dr. King's gone, and all the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act that was much in the news of late. Those had all happened, and I thought, you missed the party, buddy. And what I realized after time was that I had arrived for the second chapter when Black folks began actually to realize some of the gains that they'd fought and died for during the civil rights era. And so, I mean, the first year I was there, Maynard Jackson was elected the first Black mayor of Atlanta. And I realized that I had actually, met and dealt with and observed some of the key moments of the rise of actual political power
Hmm.
for Black folks. And so, I kind of got lured into it. But I have to tell you, so when people come up and they say, "Are you working on another book?" And all those years I'd say no. And then gradually, several years ago, I began to say, well, actually, I am. I'm working on a book. And they'd say, they were bright-eyed, and they'd say, "What's it about?" And I'd say, "Race." And they'd look at me with a double take or pinched eyebrows, or like I'd lost my complete mind. And I would say, "Well, an old white guy writing about race. What could possibly go wrong?" And
Indeed.
so I got kind of lured into it. I developed a fascination with Joel Chandler Harris
Hmm.
because of his home museum. Linda and I were supporters of it, and I wanted to answer the question, had he preserved uh, slave narratives or had he misappropriated them?
Huh.
And he was accused famously by Alice Walker in a speech at the Atlanta History Center in 1981. She accused him of stealing her heritage. And
Wow.
and I think she was mistaken. I remember Linda said, "Oh, good, Rick, you're going to argue with Alice Walker."
Yes.
Let me know how that works out. But he's a complicated figure, and so I ended up with an essay about him. And then I saw a play on Broadway, All the Way, who was a Tony winner. It was about Lyndon Johnson and his the year between Kennedy's assassination and
Hmm.
his own bid for the presidency. And there was a cameo appearance in there by a fairly obscure Georgia governor who was portrayed on the stage as being like a Wallace or a Ross Barnett, just a retrograde racist knuckle dragger, when he was, in fact, the first sort of progressive
Hmm.
governor Georgia had ever had. And so I found out you can access Lyndon Johnson's tape recordings from the Oval Office. All
Wow.
bunch of presidents have taped their conversations, as we now know.
Sure.
And in Johnson's case, the tapes are all at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. I could sit in my office in Atlanta and eavesdrop on the actual conversations that
Wow.
Johnson had with this governor and with Robert Woodruff of the Coca-Cola Company. And the playwright just got it wrong. I mean, he made a mistake, and it's not the end of the world. But I wrote an essay, an op-ed for the newspaper. This is, it's more than 10 years ago now. This is back in 2014. And I wrote an essay because a lot of it turned on the use of the N word, as we now call it. And I understand why you can't say that word. But who used it and how they used it was central to the story of this governor and Lyndon Johnson.
I'll bet.
Absolutely. And the difficulties I ran into writing about it for the newspaper were just fascinating to me. But I began reflecting on all this, and just because the Voting Rights Act has been such a big story lately, one of the things I covered was a very important special election in 1986 for the 5th District seat in Atlanta, when it had become majority black. And it pitted John Lewis against Julian Bond.
Hmm.
And it was a rough, tough election. And I wrote in my column at the time, several times, that white voters were just going to have to get used to doing what black voters had been accustomed to doing for decades, and that
Sure.
was, picking a candidate of the other race, but based on their interests. And as it happened, the white vote carried the day for John Lewis. John Lewis won what
Really?
everybody thought was a huge upset election. And he always credited me with helping get him elected.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was a good story. So the book ended up being several essays about things that I had covered as a journalist in Atlanta, and then essays about various presidents, including the current one in his first term, and then essays on all the issues we grapple with today, the DEI, color blindness, you name it, it's in there. And I'll tell you what I found out, Al, that was interesting to me. Where I got in trouble with readers, it wasn't racial at all. It was
Hmm.
generational. And so if you
Really?
have a way to get this in front of our classmates, because we all of us were born about a half dozen years before Brown. We were born into a nation that was segregated by law, by fiat of the Supreme Court of the United States. And I don't think it's possible for any of us not to feel and believe that there's been immense change for the better in our country when it comes to race. But younger generations don't, they see how far we have yet to go.
Of course.
And I had a very enlightened friend, white friend, but very enlightened, and she read my manuscript and said, Rick, I'm not sure you're as enlightened as you think you are. And I said, well, and I may not be. And so younger readers of both races are not as patient with me as I like to be with myself. But the nicest endorsement I got, and it's a blurb on the cover, was from Michael Lomax, who was a politician in Atlanta. He never did quite manage to win the mayor's office, but he was the chairman of the Fulton County Commission. He is today the president of the United Negro College Fund, overseeing a vast endowment. He's about our age, and he read the manuscript, and he said, well, you're imperfect, but you certainly admit it. And you could be sitting there on the 19th hole, having a drink, relaxing in retirement, and not have to give a moment's thought to any of this.
Yeah.
And yet you have. And he commended me for that. And I really appreciated it. But just to finish up the point, my publisher sent a copy of the manuscript out for what is called a sensitivity read.
Oh my.
Oh dear. So it went to a perfectly lovely, bright, nice young black woman, but she was just utterly horrified by some of the things that she came across. She didn't think I had moved far enough, fast enough, and I had to accept that. And
Hmm.
I embraced some of her recommendations and just sailed blithely ahead, ignoring some of the others for better or worse. But I'm glad I did it.
Wow. All right. So do you feel like you're well and truly done, or is there more, is there more in there?
Well, it's funny you would ask that because I didn't prompt you to do that, but it's a logical question, and I don't really feel I have the strength. I'm grateful I've kept my wits about me, but I have some physical ailments that I'm dealing with that limit my ability to work. But my friends are kind enough they have what they call Little Ricky stories. My mother called me Little Ricky. Topper Lynn, that broke him up so much that to this day he calls me Little Ricky, and most of my friends call me Little Ricky, like I'm the imp of Satan or something. But I'm a natural born storyteller, Al, it turns out. And I've just got a bunch of great stories. I told you one about Ted Turner, and I got about a half a dozen.
Sure.
I've had an absolutely fascinating and fulfilling life. And so I have bit by bit just been putting some of these anecdotes to paper so that they'll live on after me. I don't think it'll be published in book form, but we'll see. That's kind of about all I think I'm good for at this point.
Fascinating. Okay. So, you already made mention of something that you tell young writers and those who are convinced that they want to be writers, but since they're not writers yet, they don't know what it means to want to be a writer, really, or what it entails. You know, was it Emerson that said the test of a vocation is love of the drudgery that it entails?
Well, it's funny. I was trading a couple of emails with Rick Redmond about this conversation I'm having with you, and I said I might remind Al, it was Reynolds Price who
Hmm.
once told a classroom full of writing students, if you could possibly give this up and do something else, you really should.
Yes. Yes.
And I often think of Red Smith, the famous sports writer.
Oh,
He
yeah.
had a famous quote. He said, "Oh, writing's easy. You just sit down at the typewriter and open a vein."
Yes.
It's
Ah,
it, it's not easy. And one thing that I noticed over the years was that some days it does flow, and those are lovely days. And then some days it doesn't. And you keep at it, and your output one day may be 10 times more than it was another day, but when you go back and read it afterward, you can't tell.
mm,
So you have to be willing to accept the pain of hard work if you're going to be a writer. Even
yeah.
even if you're natural born good writer, it's still hard as hell. It really is.
Hi, everybody, classmates, Andover 66. I wish I could be with you. I'm here to read some poems in honor of good friend and wonderful classmate, Bill Haviland. He was always a seeker, interested in spiritual things. I remember he studied with Reverend Baldwin, lower year, then I was his roommate, and he underlined the Bible many times. Then he went to India and studied with Meher Baba, always very interested in improving himself in a spiritual way. The first poem is Bill Haviland. As youths, we used to travel the narrow path from the ball fields to the junior dorms. Then you let Meher Baba's imaginary God tie your mind to his narrow raft. Had you stayed married, perhaps you'd know that the path to the north is filled with slides. The piles of rocks by the side of the climbing road are cairns filled with thoughts like stones. And we are tested by the many-headed God who questions us, students without books. Our notes are only what we know from those who lead us upward. Lovers, wives, their many hands hold us upright on the same path. Climbers roped together over the crevasse. And the second poem. When I landed in her country like a canoe pulling into the wet green reeds that line the bright shores of a lake like heaven, my arms tired and my oars broken, I gave thanks that I had left the prison that we lived in, the white New England dorms with their rope ladders by the exit windows, though there was never a fire to escape. And when you turned to the bodiless God, you unspooled your loony craft in black celluloid. The unfinished tape flipped on steel reels and stopped. How could I not have known you well enough to save you? On my raft, sure, there would have been a plank for you.
The years cannot be stopped or even slowed. They set us blind on an indifferent road. You celebrate a catch, a hit, a win, and just as you and others there begin to relish what you've earned and what you've won, you blink. Another season has begun. But you have given those who've seen you play a kind of joy that will not fade away. And if they sometimes half awake at dawn see center fields and ballparks now long gone, where you track down the shots that only you could catch, then I believe that it is true that you have done what few have ever done. For joy is given free, it can't be won. And joy is not diminished by the days as they go tumbling past. And so I praise what you bestowed on us who saw you hit and run and throw. Transcendence, that was it.
Hi, Ray Healey here, and there are three people who inspired me to become a writer. My mother, our PA English teacher, Frances McCarthy, and Ernest Hemingway. My mother, an English professor at a local college, asked me at age 11 what I was reading, and I replied, 2 boys' sports books, Rambling Halfback and Backboard Fever. And she said, Ray, you need to broaden your horizons. She gave me James Fenimore Cooper's The Deer Slayer. I read Cooper's complete works, and it changed my life. At Andover, my teacher senior year was Francis McCarthy, and in spring term, he helped me write my first work, a short story about a young man who loved to play hockey and shoot rapids in a canoe. In college, I discovered Ernest Hemingway and read all of his books, including The Sun Also Rises. And in the summer after college, I flew to Paris, lived in a tent along the Seine, then hitchhiked to Pamplona, where I ran with the Bulls. I kept a diary in that trip, and that year I wrote my first book about a college grad who runs with the Bulls and had other adventures. In the 80s, I married, held several writing jobs, and my wife and I had 2 kids. Starting in 1990, over 5 years, I wrote my first novel, Ned Kelly's Hat Tricks. A Harvard hockey star battles a mob kingpin. I was a lousy typist, but I used nifty dictation device, Dragon Naturally Speaking, and night after night, I slouched in an easy chair and ended up dictating 250 pages. A friend of mine, who was an agent, read it and asked, "Who do you think you are, Dan Jenkins?" A few years later, with my English PhD in hand, I wrote a sequel to that Ned Kelly book, Ned Kelly's Bloodlust, and English Professor Battles of the Empire. I have presented this book to several agents over the years and hope it will get published. I've also written a kid's book, Ned Kelly's Wild Ride, The Boy Who Got Carried Away, about the early adventures of my title character. But it all started with my mother putting the Deerslayer in my hands at age 11.
I spent my professional career as a radio journalist, an interest that I actually started at Andover with WPAA-FM. Soon after graduation, I worked as a part-time reporter and part-time DJ at a commercial radio, WCAP-AM, in Lowell, Massachusetts, where my parents lived. And after Trinity College in Connecticut, where I worked at a TV station, I went to journalism school at Columbia in New York City. 20 years ago, after 2 decades living in Europe and Africa as a reporter for Voice of America, and additional years covering the White House when Andover alumnus George H.W. Bush was president, the J School gave me an award, which required me to come back to the school and give a speech. And that speech is relevant to my writing. It began with me saying I had considered writing a book that would be titled What They Never Taught Me in Journalism School: Reporting in the Real World. I came up with chapter headings, and my introduction went back to the origins of the J School when Joseph Pulitzer wrote in 1904, "A journalist is the lookout on the ship of state." But he never said anything about practical matters like where the life jackets or flares are, and that's where I jumped in. I went on to address the skills a real working journalist needed, starting with patience and drawing on a saying I was told in Kenya, "You Europeans have the watches, we Africans have the time." I got into the problems of bored border guards, and I included a tip on how to deflect the amorous attention of a border official who wanted to know why a woman reporter I was traveling with was unmarried. For that, it proved helpful to put a high bride price on the female journalist. I once put a price of 15 camels on a colleague who worked for the New York Times. Trust me, it was an outrageous sum. The guard was astonished, and we were allowed to get on our way quickly. There were tips in my imaginary book on how to cope at massacre sites, the perils of military press pools, and a word to the wise, to check the label of your bulletproof vest for its stopping power. My first one, in Mogadishu, sent out by the Home Office, said, and I quote, "Will not protect the wearer against rifle fire or sharp objects." Not particularly useful in a continent of AK-47s and machetes. For the record, I was wounded in Somalia, shot, sustaining minor leg wounds, and even a capable vest would have been useless. For broadcasters, this book would have a section on the problem of recording sound at a distance, like the night I tried to capture the audio of shelling and other gunfire while covering the genocide in Rwanda. I discovered later that a cricket had been sitting near my microphone, occasionally chirping over the distant thud of mortars. My fellow reporters and I dubbed that one the cricket that ate Kigali. My book would have a section on ethics, and its title would be Ostrich Feathers. It involves the issue of gift-giving, where money is useless. One such place is northern Kenya's remote Turkana country. Fortunately, I and some colleagues were traveling there with a former British colonial officer who had packed along some ostrich feathers, an essential element for traditional Turkana ceremonies. We met 2 young herders who had only a half feather, black and borrowed. We gave them a whole, nice, new, shiny white one, and they practically keeled over in delight. In return, I got a nice recording of them singing a praise song about their lead billy goat. It made for a great sound piece. The best writing comes from relishing moments like that and keeping your eyes open for the unexpected. One day in Luanda, capital of the southwest African country of Angola, I was returning from the airport late one day from a trip to one of the country's civil war zones with some aid workers. I saw a body disappearing into a drain hole by the side of the road, and one of the aid workers told me she had heard of a group of sewer boys living there who usually emerged at dawn. So the next morning I went there and saw, as the sun came up, a head pop out of the hole, followed by two arms, and eventually a whole boy in tattered shorts and filthy t-shirt emerged. Several other sleepy-looking boys followed. They were the most pathetic street kids I'd ever seen in Africa. And regrettably, I could only tell their story. And that is how I tried to make a difference. Unfortunately, today journalism is in turmoil. Oligarchs buying up and controlling media outlets, intense partisanship coloring what folks watch, listen to, and read, and artificial intelligence putting in doubt the veracity of almost anything you see, hear, and read. I'm frankly glad that I'm out of the news business and have found myself a new niche. As a kid, like many of us, I played with toy trains. I kept up my interest over the years, and in retirement, I finally made a model train layout and joined a group of fellow hobbyists, most of them in their 70s like me. I started writing articles about model trains for various publications, and today I edit a model railroad newsletter. This got me thinking a couple years ago about whether one could write a novel involving model trains, and I really wrestled with that. Besides, as someone whose longest radio broadcast scripts were around 4 minutes in length, I knew my previous efforts at book writing would stall at about 10 pages. But I figured out if you tossed in some crime, corruption, and espionage, it could be done. And that led to Dead Rail, which came out last year, and Blindsiding, a sequel which came out this past May 1st. I have a third novel in this thriller series in mind. These are self-published. Amazon makes it easy to create and publish a book at no cost, and social media makes it easy to spread the word. I'm not concerned about sales and profiting, although I do think they'd make great movies for anyone out there with a Hollywood in. I'll gladly sell the movie rights. My fellow modelers are the target audience, and they've been receptive, and a lot of other folks are enjoying them as well. And I'm satisfied with that. Besides, I like writing. I don't pretend these are great, deep, meaningful literary works. I'm having fun. And here's the thing. They represent a new challenge in my life, and I firmly believe we should be challenging ourselves even as we age. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thanks for listening.
Well, I've done 4 of the 5 kinds of writing that one can do, I guess. Textbook, where you sell your soul, pays well, but no one reads it, particularly the students. Then there's the think tank consulting work, where you sell your soul and you pay pretty much attention to what you believe, but none of that gets into the final result. You just pretty much put in what they pay you for. Did that with the Harvard Economic Research Project and Sprint. And then there's the GPO, the good old government printing office. Did that with the Nixon History Project and then the Church Committee. And you can put what you believe. Someone else slaps their name on it who never read it. So that's not particularly reassuring. And not only that, it gets buried in libraries where nobody reads it. And then I did academic publishing. Well, nobody reads that, except for these conference panhandlers who want to make money off inviting people to speak at their conferences. So that's pretty disappointing, but it helps you with the publish and perish. So it keeps you surviving in academia. And, there's some gratification in that, and some gratification that your name goes on it rather than having to give it to somebody else to do. I never did do the fiction writing that I admire some of our classmates to have succeeded in doing. That's quite admirable. I'm a diarist, writing diaries all my life, sort of giving me a Holden Caulfield view of the universe, which has the effect of cutting me off at the knees as far as creativity goes. But I admire people who do that. The only thing is I don't like very much the industry, which requires you to market the book and sell the book before the first week it's even printed out. So what's going on there is one gigantic pile of marketing, frankly, crap, that people have to pay for in order to get the position of influence to get their work published. So not too happy with that particular thing. My final comment would be about the motivation of the publishers. You've got to watch that like a shark. I mean, my father, who was in publishing for 30 years, he did the Gardner Art Through the Ages, beginning in 1968. In the last years of his life, they tried to cheat him out of his rights by giving a work for hire agreement rather than treating him as an author. And we only found out about that after he had died. And on some of my work, they weren't paying me for the foreign sales, and when they went into split editions, they weren't paying me for that. And so you have to watch them. And now, it used to be that they had really high quality editorial staff. By the time I was working with them in my final work in 1990, no editorial staff at all. We had to do our own work on computers and turn in camera-ready versions. No increase in pay, but a heck of a lot of increase in work. And the other problem with that is that we had to do our own artwork. Well, basically, the attitude towards them was take it or leave it. So I left it, and I was quite happy to leave it. It's amazing how getting out of that work really frees you up to live a life. So my attitude toward publishing is one of you can take it or leave it. You can live your life, or you can be a slave to trying to get your work read. And as audiences now get shorter and shorter time being willing to read and to spend the time to think, it's really harder to justify spending the time yourself and putting a lot of creativity into trying to get them to learn something. Anyway, I hope other people have a more positive view of the publishing world. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Hi, Jack McLean with my contribution to the PA 66 Writers Panel video series. I've written 2 books. The first, Loon, a Marine Story, published in 2009 by Random House, was a memoir about my time in the Marine Corps between spring term of our senior year until my college registration 2.5 years later. The second book, Found, a Veteran Story, is a follow-on about my first 43 years as a Vietnam veteran. Loon, I wrote as part of my therapy for post-traumatic stress. It was based on 110 letters home that I'd written when I was in the Marine Corps, and originally started out as a What Did Daddy Do During the War book for my 3 daughters. It morphed into something a lot different that was helpful not only to me in my recovery, but to many other people who comrades in arms who served, classmates like you, who may not have served and wanted to get some idea of what it would have been like if you had, and widows and parents and all manner of people, and the Marine Corps. It went on to become required reading as part of the Marine Corps reading list. So I was obviously proud of that, in addition to being blown away. Found was a book I didn't want to write because in recounting my first 43 years back and the struggles that I had with post-traumatic stress and the ill effects from my heavy exposure to the defoliant Agent Orange, why would I want to go back and write about that? But I did. It was published 3 years ago, and like Loon, it's done pretty well. And by the same token, gives people who hadn't served or who hadn't been through such trauma an indication of what it's like for somebody like you, because we were all at school together. Had you been? Many of you have read both books, and I thank you and I appreciate that. I was trying to think of something that would, without delving too deeply into much of it, I was trying to think of something that might sum up the period between, the critical period between when I got home and when I began college. It was a day, it was registration day, and my mind was, one hand, I was 2 weeks back from Vietnam, so on one hand I'm there, and on the other hand I'm registering for college courses. I'd like to read just a section from chapter 29 in Loon, which relives, if you will, that day, those hours. Memorial Hall is one of the older structures of the Harvard University campus. It's a cavernous edifice of dubious architecture that was built in 1878 to commemorate those Harvard alumni who died for the Union during the Civil War. It was being used this day as a center for freshman registration. The entrance hall was huge, drafty, and dimly lit. Upon its dingy old paneled walls were engraved the names of the dead, arranged by order of graduating class. This was the first war for me war memorial for me since I had returned. I wondered if Sid or Snowball would ever have their names carved on a memorial. I hoped so, but it didn't seem likely. Those dead on inscribed memorials were older, our parents' age or older, not kids like us. Besides, our World War wasn't like World War II or the other big ones. There didn't seem to be any sentiment to remember those who died in Vietnam. It became increasingly obvious during my brief month back that Vietnam was not a war Americans would choose to celebrate in the grand tradition of the Great Wars. Would Harvard later commission a noted architect to design a monument such as this to the sacrifice of her grand young sons who had served in Vietnam? It seemed unlikely. Indeed, few sons of Harvard would ever serve, let alone die in Vietnam. Elite colleges had become a sanctuary for military service because of the draft laws that allowed students to defer military service for the term of their attendance. To ensure that status for ensuing generations, Harvard and many other colleges eliminated on-campus ROTC the following year to protest America's involvement in the Vietnam War. Thus began an enormous schism between the military and the country's centers of higher learning. This continues largely unchanged to this day. Harvard had admitted me, but there was little, if anything, about the institution that was friendly to the veterans of Vietnam War. I knew that I had earned my place, but would I ever feel respected by my class or the institution for my achievement of the previous years? Those precious few who were curious about my time in the Marine Corps dwelled more on their complete inability to understand why someone like me ever would have enlisted in the first place. Mostly my Vietnam service rarely came up. When it did, I was not the initiator. The interior of Memorial Hall was more like akin to a Gothic cathedral than a university building. High above, great wooden arches dwarfed the interior. Entering exterior light was refracted through dozens of enormous stained glass windows. Before me was stretched the length of a football field of folding tables manned by a cross-section of university life, including athletic teams, academic and social clubs, and volunteer organizations and anti-war groups. Hundreds of voices echoed off the walls and then echoed again and again. The discordant cacophony was disoriented and grated on every nerve. The occasional loud noise still made me flinch and would instantly take me back to Vietnam. It would take minutes to recover my composure. Noises rattled me. To a large degree, they still do. The involuntary responses for my survival that had been so finely honed were not as easily buried in the memories of the experience. I was approached by all manner of hawkers eager for my participation in their chosen extracurricular activity. It had elements of a bazaar. The rowing coach took particular interest given my height and muscularly lean frame. The students all looked young. How was I ever going to fit in? Not even 90 days had passed since the horror of LZ Loon, less time than most of these students had spent on summer vacation. After a bewildering several minutes of absorbing, frenetic scene, I was directed to a corner of a table over which was displayed a sign with the letters K through P. I stood briefly in line and then recited my name to the person behind the table and was given a fat manila envelope that contained registration materials. My name was typed boldly on the outside. No service number, no rank of corporal, just my name. Unlike how I felt on my first day at Andover, I now felt that I belonged and I had earned my way through the front door as surely as if I'd gotten 800s on my college boards. I had little concern about the academic difficulties I had faced at Andover would follow me. I'm pleased to report that they did not. I registered for courses in the areas required for freshmen that included the full range of liberal arts disciplines. There would be no care and cleaning of the M16 rifle with Sergeant Rodriguez here. The college pep band wandered through the building, playing fight songs. One such, 10,000 Men of Harvard, was composed to raise the blood of the faithful on the football field against Yale. Not exactly the Marines' hymn, but then again, Yale wasn't exactly the North Vietnamese army either. It all seemed simply manageable, almost quaint. Later that afternoon, I was sitting on the steps of the Fog Art Museum prior to an orientation session. A lovely girl sat on a step nearby. Nervously, I took a deep breath and opened. "Hi." She turned slowly as though lost in thought. "Oh, hi," she responded. "Are you here for the orientation?" I continued. "Yes." "Where are you from?" I asked. She didn't appear to be particularly responsive. "Connecticut, Ethel Walker," she answered. Ethel Walker was an all-girls prep school outside Hartford. She did not ask me about me, so I stumbled forth anyway. I'm from here, well, near here, Brookline. I went to Andover. This was going nowhere. I felt as though I were in a battle with neither a rifle nor training. I was devoid of all social skills. This was tough. Andover, she lit up suddenly. Did you know Freddie Witherspoon? He went to Andover too. I met him last summer on the Cape. Well, no, I mean, his name sounds familiar. He would have been a sophomore, I guess, when I graduated. Now what? I thought, might as well come out with it. I actually graduated from Andover 2 years ago. I've been serving in the United States Marine Corps for the past 2 years. I just got back from Vietnam. Oh, that was it. Oh, no, how great it must be to be home. No, thank you for your service. No, you're a fucking baby killer. No, I've always wanted to do it with a Marine. No, nothing. Just, oh. With that, she rose and headed up the steps into the building. The conversation, such as it was over. I had learned a valuable lesson. Few, if any, people at Harvard cared about military service, particularly Vietnam service. From that point on, for the next 4 years and well beyond, I hardly mentioned it.
That's Rogers and Hart's if they asked me I could write a book. And for all the time that I spent in bookstores and record stores and libraries as a kid, it was pretty much inevitable that I would want to grow up and write books and make records. And eventually I ended up being able to do both. I did a little bit of writing at Andover. I had a few things that were in the mirror, but nothing I would want to look back on without deep shame. And when I went to Brown, I was trained to be a novelist. Now, my poetry books, which you see a couple of them behind my head here, they're 100-poem collections. So you could argue that they're not really, I didn't write them as books. I wrote 100 installments, one poem at a time. But when I was at Brown, I was trained to write novels. And in fact, I wrote a couple of novels. So I was a fiction writer, and I also wrote plays, and I also wrote poetry when I was there. But my main training was as a novelist, and my mentor was a guy named R.V. Castle, who had just come from the Iowa Writers Workshop. And he preached that the writing of the novel was the only really acceptable activity for a writer. So I bought into his program and I learned a lot from him. And although I didn't end up continuing as a novelist, the things that I learned from him informed the way that I work today and all the things that I do, whether I'm writing a poem or a play or writing a song that's eventually going to go into an album. So process, I learned something very, very important about process. And what he preached, which was a method for writing what used to be called literary fiction, which is to say not genre fiction, where you really need to plan out where you're going to take your story and know how it ends pretty much before you begin. The idea of writing a quote-unquote literary novel was really a process of accessing your deeper unconscious. And that when you sat down thinking that you knew the story that you were going to write, you didn't really. And so what you needed to do was to write that story, do a draft, to tell the story that you believed you had in you to tell. When the draft was complete, you went back and looked at it to try to detect where the real story lay beneath the surface of what you had produced first time through. And so I was trying to look for that, to draw those things out. Those deeper elements of story then became the next version. And you often threw out much, if not most, of what you had written in your draft, your first draft, which got you into it. And that's when the work happened, was in the rewriting in the second time through. And but the idea was not to plan, to know your characters, to know the starting situation, and then let your characters tell you where they wanted to go, what they wanted to say, what they wanted to do. And I wrote a couple of novels. I wrote one when I was an undergraduate and a second one when I was in graduate school immediately after that. And at the time, I wasn't writing poetry and I wasn't writing songs yet. That's what I thought I was going to do. But then I got a job playing in a band and I went on the road for a couple of years. And when I came back, I got a job teaching in a private school. And I was coaching 2 seasons of the year and teaching a full load. And I found that I couldn't manage to write long form fiction. I tried to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and put in 2 hours writing every day, but going into classrooms with teenagers and then coaching them at the end of the day, they got my best attention. So I shifted into writing short forms. I started writing songs. I went back to writing poetry. And that's what I did the whole time that I was teaching, which was 25 years. And that's what I've continued to do in the 20 years since I stopped teaching. And I went back to writing plays about 10 years ago. So this was what I learned. And what I've discovered is that while I don't always go through the novel writing process, the process of accessing my unconscious, which is to say to begin, if it's a song or a poem or a play, without knowing where it's going, and then allowing myself to be led and often being surprised by where I'm taken, is the part of the preaching that I got in college that my mentor was so rigorously devoted to. We had a lot of arguments later on because, of course, I stopped writing novels. And so to him, everything that I did after that was just not worthy of my time. But we disagreed on that, and that was okay. So I'm going to close by reading a sonnet about the process, about the writing process. And this is what is going on inside of my head when I'm doing my thing. It's called The Next Idea. I make a space for it, and it appears. I feel it coming on, as though I'm filled flush to the brim, and then beyond. It spills up out into the light. Its image clears. It soon declares itself and calls by name what I must call it, and must let it be. My mind is empty. I wait patiently and watch it take its shape within the frame. It often comes continuous, complete. Sometimes I need to pause and clean the way, but trusting as I do that it will say all that it needs to when at last we meet. Such visits have been going on for years. I make a space for it, and it appears.